Hey everybody, Brandon here. Welcome back to a new video. Today we are going to be going over my 16th tournament game. Now, as I mentioned before, the previous game or the previous video to this was, I believe, after this game or the next one. It was sometime during this day and it was a loss. Now my rating, I believe, is 1281. You will see it on the screen. Anyways, I am starting a 5-game tournament and I am playing with the white pieces in my first game. And this is also my first rematch. And I am playing Atharva again. And before this game, or before this match, when we played last, he was rated around 1200 and I was lower 1300s. So before I was slightly high rated, now he has about a 200 rating difference than me. He's definitely improved a lot since we last played, and let's see how the game continues. Now we have the move e4 from me, e5, knight f3, knight c6, and bishop e5. Of course, I'm going to go into my Ruy Lopez, as that is what I was studying for a huge amount of time at the time. a6, bishop to a4, knight f6, and castles. After bishop to e7, I played rook to e1. Now the move is b5. However, my opponent did not play this, and instead castles. The problem with castling here is that the e5 pawn is undefended. So, of course, I take it. You can't take it yet, of course, because if knight takes e5, knight takes e5. I lose a piece. However, bishop takes c6, d takes c6, and now knight takes on e5. And as we can see here, I'm up a piece. Not a piece, I'm up a pawn, the e5 pawn. And this is a very crucial pawn because it was controlling the center. When you lose a pawn like the a pawn or the h pawn or something like this, usually that's not as big of a deal. You get something called compensation. Sometimes it takes some time for your opponent to win the pawn, and it doesn't really influence the game too much until the end game. However, when you take a central pawn, that can influence the game immediately because now they're not controlling key squares like in this game, d4 and f4. And I immediately go for a d4 in the future. We see queen d4, knight f3, so the problem is they weren't winning back the pawn because this knight to f3, this normal queen to d4 move is always nice to have, but they just don't have it because knight to f3 attacks their queen, and that was the only square that they could attack my knight and the pawn. So queen to b6 and h3, I just want to restrict their pieces. Now that I have the pawn, I just gotta make a reasonable position, or just gotta play reasonably, and I should be okay here. We see bishop to c5 and d4. Of course, I just don't want to allow anything here. Now rook to d8 might be tempting, but it doesn't work because after taking on c5, rook takes d1 and taking on b6. If they take my rook, I take back, and I'm up a piece, so this would not be good for them. Instead, they realized this, so they played bishop to e7, admitting that it wasn't such a great move. Now, after bishop to e7, I played knight c3. Maybe a knight to d2 would have been a little stronger with c3. The whole point is I'm trying to keep my position very compact, but knight to c3 is okay. I would just say for a position that I'm already a pawn up, it doesn't really make too much sense to play this type of move. And we see rook d8. And now we can see, hey, there's kind of a pin on this pawn, and that's a little annoying, and it's hard to get out of it. Maybe I should have just played queen to e2 here, and that would have just helped things because the d4 pawn is protected by the knight. So if they sacrifice the exchange, that would not matter because we would be winning material from this, and this would not be good from them. Not even just that, but there's also the move bishop to e3. So either way, you'd be winning the exchange. And maybe something like this. And white is just winning this game because they have more material, +2, because they just won the exchange, even though they gave back a pawn. And yeah, you can't play this position. So anyways, rook to d8, I played a3. And the whole point of this, I believe, was to prevent bishop to b4. This move is a little weird because they're making threats in the center and I'm not doing anything about it. And I really do not like this move a3. It should be okay. Like it's not a losing move. but it gives my opponent some tempo. And tempo means just extra moves. Because a3 doesn't really do too much in the position. It only has a prophylactic idea, but this was the least of my concerns here. Regardless, after a3, bishop to e6. I played rook to b1. The whole point is I want to develop this bishop, but the b2 pawn was undefended, and it was a little awkward. And now we can see why knight to d2 was better, because if the knight went to d2, it could always go to g3, and it would have been in a much more secure place, and the bishop on c1 is actually well placed after a move like c3. However, here we're seeing that my pieces are just not making moves they want to make. And c5 now from my opponent, and now we can see that stuff's getting dangerous. The problem is d5 is tempting, but we see c6. This isn't hanging, because if we take it, then rook takes d1, right? So this is just not possible. So unfortunately, they are just threatening to attack it, but I just take. I decided that this is probably best, because after d takes on c5, if they take my queen, I just take their queen, and then we exchange rooks. So it's not actually that bad, and I'm still up a pawn. And my position is very easy, much easier to play. I wouldn't say it's like very, very easy. They still have the bishop pair, so they still have some compensation, but objectively it should still be much better for white. Anyways, bishop takes c5 instead, not wanting to go for all those trades, which is reasonable, because usually when you get into those endgames, you're a pawn down. It's hard to hold those positions, although again they would have the bishop pair. It's just a matter of technique, and proving that the bishop pair is worth an extra pawn can be a lot more difficult than just saying that it is, and even though a lot of people do believe it is. So after bishop takes c5, I played queen to e2. You need to defend f2 in this position, and a move like, well, rook to f1 drops the queen, so it's really the only move in the position. And then queen to c6, and this sets up a really, really nice trap. The whole thing is they're trying to play bishop c4 here, and I allowed it. Instead, I should play a move like bishop to f4. A move like bishop to f4 keeps my position reasonable, or after bishop to c4, there is a move, and we will go back to this, but I don't want to spoil it yet. Let's go back. Queen c6, bishop to d2, which is not a good move, because this bishop is actually blocking a lot of my pieces. And after b5, the best move is like bishop g5. Just moving it again. Like, that's how bad the piece is. Even though it develops and connects my rooks, that was not the concern here. And bishop takes a3 wasn't actually really an issue either, because there's always knight e5 ideas. Where after knight e5, the bishop will be lost after taking. But okay. Here, after b5, I'm pretty scared. I played bishop to b4. I tried to attack their bishop. This is okay, but again, if I just played bishop to g5 and kept calm, things would be fine, and there's a secret resource if bishop c4. But okay, b5, b4, now they play bishop c4. Now what do you play here? In reality, if you move away, you're just putting yourself in a pin. This is, in reality, the only square you can go to. That would not be good. So instead, we need to trade. We need to force trades somehow. And the way to do this is, it's a little tricky, but I hope you guys can calculate it. It's the move knight to e5. So even though our queen is attacked, we attack their queen. And it is actually very important that they play b5, and we will go back to this in just a second. But this b5 move, and also their bishop being hanging, actually works in our favor here. Because, for example, what happened in the game was bishop takes e2, knight takes e6, rook takes d2, so it looks like they're winning a piece, except we win our piece back. And we're up a pawn here. So the point is, as well, there's no knight takes e4 because their bishop is hanging. So this also had to be calculated. But if we go all the way back here, the problem is with bishop to d2 and b5, they didn't have to play b5 here. This was a mistake on their part. They could have just played bishop c4 immediately. The whole point of this is that bishop takes f2 would win my queen. So I would be losing in this position because I just lost a bishop and I have bishop for just a pawn and a queen, and that's, yeah, no, I can't do that. So here, going back, the whole point is after bishop to c4, how I'm losing pretty much is after queen d1, queen b6. There's not really any good way to stop the win of the exchange because, well, where do I put my rook, right? There's no options to put my rook anywhere, and if I have to play a move like this, it just still should be losing. For example, bishop to e3 should cause issues, followed by queen to d6 even. But there's just a lot of options here, and you can tell that if they win this pawn back, even though I have the e4 pawn and I have a center pawn for the f pawn, this is much worse for me. This is close to losing, so instead the only real option is rook to f1, where after bishop takes, queen takes. But we're down the exchange. This is very bad. Yeah, black has the material and the advantage, as you'd say, in this position, so very unfortunate. But b5, luckily, the problem is there's no knight to e5, and let's explain why. So here, bishop to c4, knight to e5, bishop takes e2, knight takes e6, rook takes d2, rook takes e2, rook takes e2, and knight takes e2. And at the very end of the line, they win my knight. So I'm losing material because of this. And this line, or these lines were also working before. So there were a lot of knight e5s. Like here, if any bishop c4 stuff. So yeah, and that's why bishop f4 is stronger, because if bishop c4, then there's also knight to e5 in these lines. And I believe they work out fine because the bishop's not hanging on d2. So bishop takes e2, knight takes e6. If they take back, then we take, and everything's fine, and we are up a pawn, and we should still have a much better position. All right, anyways, going back to the game. Going back to the game here. b4, bishop c4, knight e5, bishop takes e2, knight takes e6, rook takes d2, rook takes e2, rook takes e2, and knight takes e2. We see the move bishop to e6 as the piece was attacked. Now knight to g3, rook to e8, so just attacking the pawn. I decided to play a trickier move because I didn't want to trade or anything, and I didn't want to go defensive with rook to e1. So instead I play rook to d1, as this pawn is defended tactically, as after knight takes e4, knight takes e4, and we win a piece, as if they take, we have a back rank checkmate. They have to play rook e8, and this is checkmate. So, of course, they did not fall for this. They played king to f8. Now they're trying to prepare to take it, as if they can take the pawn, then they're equal on material. However, I play e5. And this makes their knight very uncomfortable, because it doesn't have any of these options. It has to go back to g8. So we're just improving our pieces, as we can see here. And my piece on c6 it's not doing anything crazy, but it's a strong piece. In reality, maybe rook e6 would be best, but even then I was planning on going rook d8 and just taking on e8, and I thought that this would just be a near winning endgame for me. So unfortunately, moves like rook e6 just don't even work. And knight e7, I decided to take. I thought that this would be okay because we still have two minor pieces on the board, and if I just refuse trades, that might be just a little too ridiculous, because then they would, all of a sudden be able to coordinate. So after taking, I played f4, so I just tried to restrict their pieces as much as possible. The rook can never go to the d file unless it goes to e8. And I have ideas now of knight f5 or even knight e4. And usually when you have a knight on the same color as your pawns, it usually coordinates quite well, as we can see here. And it's ready to jump in at any point. Now they play g6, and this helps me with my activity, as we should say, because although the f5 and h5 squares are restricted, now I can go, well, not yet, rook to d3, king e8, and knight to e4. Knight to e4 was better immediately, but rook to d3 is fine. It's just that knight e4 immediately threatens just to go to f6, and this piece is just so active. It's kind of insane. But rook to d3, king e8, knight e4. The problem is if they go rook d7, I have knight f6. So rook to d7, knight to f6, and I win the piece. Not even the exchange, the whole piece, because they have to move away, and doesn't matter how they move because I just take it. And the knight is protecting the rook. Or I could take it with the knight, and it's protected by the rook as well. So, okay, king e8, knight e4, and king f8, and knight f6. Now this piece is just a monster. It's impossible to move this rook anywhere at all unless they move the c-pawn, but it's still difficult to move the c-pawn. And their king is restricted because their rook is restricted. So this objectively should be completely winning, and we'll see how I won this game. King to g7, rook to d8, just going in for some possible checks, so I'm not too concerned here. h5, rook to g8 check. I just wanted to force their king to a weaker square, king h6, and then move over and attack the a-pawn. And I have some devious ideas behind this. They played rook e6, and I played g4. Now we can see the whole point. I want to go g5 check, and rook g8 checkmate. And this will come with tempo because of it, so that's why I went for rook to rook to g8, and then rook to a8. H takes g, and g5. And after this, it's just a forced checkmate. After rook h8, king g6, rook to g8, and king h6, and f takes on g5 with checkmate. Now this was a pretty good game overall. I did make some mistakes. I would say the biggest one was missing that bishop to c4 was a huge problem here. After bishop to d2, bishop to c4, and I would say they're winning. I would say my opponent Atharva would win this game because I know my temper when at this point, like when I was playing tournaments, I knew my temper, and if I lost the exchange in this type of position, I would be very upset and I would end up losing. So that's unfortunate, but what happens, and luckily I did win this game instead of lose. But it is a very important thing to notice, as that was a very big miss by me. However, that was game 1 of game 5, and I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you in round 2. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.